And it is time for Building Rural Wealth. With us this morning, we have Denise Miller, Senior Vice President.
Senior Vice President, yes.
And we have Kayla Roebuck, Vice President.
Yeah, there you go.
All right, we're going to talk about business. Your business is thriving. It is your plan. Okay, Caleb, set the stage here for me. What's going on?
Yeah, today, talking about rural business owners, professionals, and we talk to a lot of them, but, a lot of the conversations we have kind of looks at, what is financial success versus financial stability? They can go hand in hand. They sound similar, but they can be very different, and financial success, when we look at clients and help them evaluate, can be something, usually pretty easy to spot, For business owners, it's, typically steady income over time. It's increasing their revenue. It's owning more property or land or expanding. It's their retirement accounts growing in the background or, reducing debt. And that could be business owners or professionals or investors, you can see that on paper. It's easy to track. It's easy to kind of measure. It is that, financial, that financial success. But, most of those indicators, they don't show the structure. They don't show all of the stability of it, which is much, much harder to measure. And, from our perspective, that security, it's about whether, what you've built can consistently support you over time. But when you're looking at that financial stability for business owners or for professionals, you start to look at different set of questions. When could work become optional? If you step back from that business, would your income actually look any different or would it stay the same? What if something unexpected happened? Could your household keep functioning? Or, even like we're going through now, if market fluctuations are impacting your retirement plans, your business, your target date, what does that look like? And, many business owners, many investors, many professionals, they spend 20, 30 years, working at that financial success, but, they spend a lot less time looking at that financial stability of it, which is why we're here, but makes sense. But it is even more crucial to tie those things in. And, that's the big distinction, that accumulation versus structure.
All right. So you have to explain this to me. Success is loud and structure is quiet.
Well, I think we have to talk about what accumulation without definition is. And, healthy balances in retirement accounts, if you've been consistently, contributing to a solo 401k or a SEP IRA contribution, and you've got some brokerage accounts and they're growing over time, equity in the business itself, but no one has actually calculated what income these assets actually need to produce someday, and when the withdrawals could realistically begin, and how market volatility affects that timeline. A growing balance is progress, but a projected income plan is what helps people start visualizing retirement. And these plans provide an anchor for folks when the markets get volatile. Without defined targets, people tend to react more emotionally. And these plans, from an operations standpoint, we've seen businesses with accounts that they're just scattered all over the place. And when everything's all over the place, guess what also you have? You have some chaos. And one of the biggest parts of planning is simply organizing what already exists. And it's about bringing clarity and visualization about where that consolidation makes sense. And it's about putting the pieces you've already built, putting those together.
Connect those pieces for me, Caleb. Put those together.
Yeah, like Denise said, a lot of successful people, they already have those kind of pieces in place, but I would say, they're maybe not organized in the right way or have those kind of pillars to support that foundation in the way that it needs to be to kind of have that proper structure. And when we kind of talk about it, we do kind of look at those core pillars, with that first one being that income clarity. Like Denise mentioned, whatever you have in your account, that doesn't truly answer, how much can you sustainably live on. So retirement's not about, hitting that specific number. It's about what can that specific number produce in sustainable income. For business owners, that might come from several places as well, too. Like we talked about in the context of planning, it could be your retirement investment portfolios, but it could be land or rental income. It could be the eventual sale of a business or transition. It could be part-time income. It could be a spouse is still working while you are transitioning or retiring. So planning for that income, involves different withdrawal strategies. What is the impact of inflation on that withdrawal pattern, over time, and what are healthcare costs going to do? That's a big one. A lot of people, business owners, employees, don't even think about is their own healthcare costs, in there. And again, no one can control the markets, but can you create that structure that helps, remove some of that market uncertainty, or, gives you, some peace of mind that it's been stress tested to know, it can handle some volatility. Which leads into pillar 2 is that risk assessment. Your risk tolerance does shift over time, but knowing, what is your actual risk tolerance, where you stand today, where's your portfolio, and where you want to be, is very critical. When you're in your, 35 to 40 to 50s, those market fluctuations, are more tolerable. But, as retirement gets near, those account balances, like Denise said, have grown because you have had that financial success. It becomes, a 10% drop on $1 million portfolio is much different than a 20% drop on a $100,000 portfolio, just because the math is, much bigger and much more real, especially as you're closer. Pillar 3 then would be operational readiness, and what we mean by that is, do your beneficiaries reflect your reality? Are your estate documents up to date? Does your spouse and your family understand the current structure? Again, which is important. We talked about whether business owners, is your spouse involved in the business or outside of it? That can be a different conversation. And have you kept important documents and information organized? So, that means you're operationally ready. Where things are at. If something would happen tomorrow, what the next steps are, who's going to step in place, what that is. Then pillar 4, especially for business owners or employees, is, that transition timeline. And again, this is what looks different for everybody. This is where we say, talking to your friend, hey, even if you work at the same job in the same place, industry, everybody's transition timeline is going to be different because it depends on your family, your spouse, your own needs, and for professionals, it might mean, not everybody wants to retire right then. It's retiring, like we say, that work optional. So you could be reducing hours, you could be consulting, you could be mentoring, a younger person for leadership. For those business owners, though, it is, what is that business actually worth? What is the transition? Is that going to be internal or external? Is there an internal section? Which, again, part of that conversation is figuring that out. A lot of business owners struggle just even figuring that part out. Yep. Like I said, even if you have financial success, it's, hey, aligning those pillars so you have the right structure, so they're all kind of have that foundation for you.
Okay.
I think that's really true because, people don't realize that there's a foundation. And they don't realize all of the different moving pieces. And I find it really interesting that you just assume, well, I just assume that it's going to happen, or you just assume it's going to work out that way, and you really need a plan. You really need to talk about that.
The middle years let's talk about those, you mentioned those 30s, 40s, 50s. Let's talk about the 40s and 50s, the middle years. What are we looking at here?
Well, you
Denise?
have to look at some psychology.
Oh, we're getting into psychology
we're
here,
do a little psychology.
Oh, my.
This
may be a little dangerous.
I know, it is. And I'm not a therapist. I'm not a licensed therapist.
Duly noted.
Anyway, we always have to give these disclosures.
Yes.
So I thought I'd throw that out. So for many business owners, the middle years are the high performance years. That's where you've got your peak earnings, your peak responsibility, and peak financial pressure. The business may be growing, employees depend on you, but your family responsibilities are still very real. And during these years, long-term planning can easily get pushed down the priority list.
Well, and that's why Denise kind of touched on it. That's where you probably see the most financial success. Hey, you can see because it's something that you can measure. Your account balances, the business, all those things. Your lifestyle hopefully is improving too. But it's like, that structure then, if that structure's not in place as that builds, it kind of does. You can see how it kind of can, lead to some of that oversight or cause some gaps that makes the whole picture as you get closer to retirement, not as sound.
Yeah.
And sometimes that delay happens, and because of a fear of disappointing projections. And so, speaking from personal experience as a business owner, you tend to do what when you own the business? You tend to put your money back into the business. Then you kind of get to your 40s and 50s and you go, whoa, wait a minute, what have we done for us?
Mm-hmm.
And that's a trade-off. I mean, it's kind of an uncomfortable trade-off. But you have to take into consideration that it's not all about, you can't lose your identity as you're actually an employee of your business, whether you want to realize it or not.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to take into account and treat yourself like you are an employee. And that can be uncomfortable. And planning and prioritizing that clarity doesn't force a decision. It gives you options.
Takeaways. Put this kind of all together for me, Caleb. What I need to boil this down to a few points I need to keep in mind.
For people listening, that step one is, measuring clearly. You do need to run some income projections. Take that financial success of those numbers on those statements, and model it. Work with somebody that can model it for you. Of what are some conservative assumptions to stress test your numbers. To make sure they work. Looking at different retirement ages, looking at different spending scenarios. Up and down. What does that look like? Are those projections? They're not promises, but again, those projections give a lot more clarity, take out some of that ambiguity, and, I say, play out the scenarios, best case, worst case, base case, and, gives you a good idea. Step two would be to define what is actually enough. Then this is what we talk a lot of people about. Again, doesn't matter how big your pot is, how much do you need from it,
right.
Clarifying that lifestyle, your values, kind of what is your idea of financial freedom, work optional, and it's hard not to, but try not to compare yourselves to others. What matters, most to you. And that's what we say. It's all individualized. Even people working in the same business, same industry. That stuff is all personal. Step three would be organizing. Reviewing those beneficiaries, those estate documents. Ensuring your spouse is included, knows what's going on. Incorporating all their assets and planning. And step four is aligning that risk with your timeline. Denise mentioned it, making gradual portfolio adjustments, avoiding those emotional responses, and considering, your total exposure, not just your investments, but also your business concentration and all that. And again, that's all hard to do all on its own. So, having somebody help you that can help you through some of those things, because, a lot of it is emotionally driven, but timeline driven, preference driven, family driven.
Yeah. You can certainly help remove that whole emotional piece of that,
and
which is
fear.
huge. And the
and
fear,
people are fearful, well, what if I don't, how do I know? How do I know if I have enough money?
Right. So kind of wrap it up for me here, Denise.
Remember that success builds assets, but structure builds resilience. And for many business owners, there comes a point where the focus naturally shifts from building to protecting and organizing what you've built. And if you're beginning to think about a transition, the difference between success and security, it may be a good time to define what the next phase of your financial life looks like.